Can I confirm them both audible and visible?
Yep, both are fine.
Okay. Okay, my time will begin in three, two, one. For the benefit of the world, for every person who suffers from climate change, we think that it's incredibly important for the US to pursue the aggressive development of a renewable energy sector. There's going to be three things coming out of first prop. First of all, we're going to explain what this debate looks like and what the aggressive pursuit of this is. Second of all, two arguments. First, on the how this uniquely allows the world to fight against climate change, and the second argument is going to be on how we benefit the economies of every country in the world. First of all, we want to make very clear that we think that this debate is going to be about the benefit of the world and not just the benefit of the US in particular, because it's not an actor motion. First, then, what do we think the aggressive pursuit of this development sector looks like? Three main things we want to focus on. One, it looks like the increased investment from the US government into renewable companies. So it looks like subsidies, tax breaks, and these other kinds of investment into the sector to improve its capacity. Second of all, it's increasing capacity to install these renewable outside of the domestic sector as well, into countries with other offices, shipping, etc. Third of all, it says that it looks like opening US mining in to other companies to allow the increased production of lithium, cobalt, etc., minerals that are important when it comes to having a very strong renewable sector. We say that the US is uniquely able to produce these metals as they have massive reserves and they haven't done so, especially because of the blocking of mining in Biden's administration. As a result, we say this threefold approach is likely going to be what it comes and what's needed in order to have the aggressive development of this kind of sector. All in all, we say it's very similar to China's strategy and it's going to look like becoming a one-stop shop for this kind of technology. We're going to replicate this in the US, but with a much higher capacity, which the US is going to provide. First argument then, we say that this uniquely allows the world to fight against climate change. Three mechanisms under this. First of all, on technological capacity. We say the US has major technological sectors like Silicon Valley's, some of the best universities in the world, looks like Stanford, Harvard, etc. And third of all, many programs like Oak Hearts to get scientists into the country. This means it has the unique capacity to invest within the sector and fuel massive innovation because it's simply better than any other country at doing this kinds of things when it comes to the academic standpoint. We also want to say that the reason that it hasn't been done very effectively in the current status quo is on the basis that the US has not had the incentive to invest into green technology. Simply put, because they keep importing these panels from other countries, they've not been focusing on the mining because they think it was negative. Second of all, though, on industrial capacity. We say that in recent days, the US has pulled out of Taiwan and other countries when it usually imported its materials from, and has spent considerable money to beef up domestic industry. Note that there already has been a slow burn, as we've seen on tariffs to Chinese solar panels, but note that this has been unable to do anything to developing a very effective US grid. We say as a result of this, an aggressive shift is the necessary need when it comes to differences in the status quo. But second of all, we say that the US has just large industrial capacity through the blue collar workers that have been unemployed in recent years. These same workers can be retrained effectively to manufacture, install, and move these same solar panels. But third, we say that the US economy is the largest in the world and many billions of dollars are used. Battery capacity then. We say that the biggest difficulty for cheap and effective access to renewables is battery costs. This looks like lithium ion batteries that cost twice as much as solar and wind. This means that it is often the biggest barrier of entry for any country in order to get renewables. As a result, we see that the US empirically has massive reserves of lithium and cobalt in the millions of tons, but it's oftentimes blocked in the status quo because of the environmental concerns that we've seen. So it looks like the US government blocking Ioneer's mine in Regulate Ridge over TM's buckwheat, a tiny plant that nearly got wiped out by squirrels, obviously something that doesn't matter to the broad sense of society. We say that we should not weigh these kinds of plans and these kinds of policies over the world as a whole, the people in the world, and we need this aggressive pursuit as a result of this and battery capacity. How does this improve access to renewables then? Three pieces under this. First of all, we say that the amount of renewables on the market just goes up considerably. This means that more and more countries are able to purchase solar, wind, etc. at much lower prices. This means it's overall improving the broad access to the technologies in largely positive ways. But second of all, we say this encourages much more innovation and technology as a result of this. This looks like weaponizing the technology and technological capacity of the US, which looks like better photovoltaic cells, more effective wind turbines, and better batteries, etc. Note that we've already seen these technologies grow massively in the current status quo. We said that the current investment is going to be largely beneficial when it comes to making even better and better technologies that is just able to democratize these renewable energies to everyone in society. But third of all, we say that cheaper battery costs are just a godsend because more lithium on the market, more cobalt on the market is going to be so beneficial when it comes to reducing the prices overall. We've seen a price reduction in the current status quo, but we say that when you have and you access the entire capacity of the US U.S. In the minerals, it's going to be much more effective ability for countries and companies alike to access this kind of things. And we want to say just how important renewables are to the fighting against climate change. They allow us to reduce 75% of global greenhouse emissions that are emitted in energy production costs and just reduce global warming to an absolutely massive extent. And just think about how damaging climate change is to people. It looks like hurricanes in Florida causing billions in damages, massive wildfires in California, huge droughts in Africa, just removing the ability of poor farmers to have food, their ability to them to have economic money in their pockets. This is huge humanitarian costs, massive amounts of deaths that are getting results, and also huge economic costs, preventing people from getting good lives, preventing them from moving forward in society. We say that climate change, no matter what, is the biggest impact that any of us can try to vie for in this debate. And we say that we are just the better side to prove this, and we've done this structurally. Second argument then, before that, I'll take a POI. None is available. Argument two then, why this benefits people economically. First of all, we say that generally speaking, renewables are just much better at creating effective energy costs for the majority of needs that exist in the status quo. We say that developing countries are uniquely able to benefit from this and oftentimes are the most vulnerable actor because otherwise they do not have the investment. They have many people who are unable to have electricity in the status quo. What is the problem with fossil fuel plants, nuclear plants, etc., all of the other alternatives that opposition might talk about? We say that the biggest thing is that they're all large plants. You need to have centralized locations near an urban center. And we say this is only possible and it's only been seen to work in developed nations who have these key city centers and large cores. We say that this is simply not true in developing countries. The majority of countries would like you to know, with the majority of individuals. Because you have many villages. You do not have the same level of population density in very large centers. You have them spread out among the country. This means that the uniquely modular nature of renewables, i.e., it's easier to install some solar panels than a fossil fuel plant in these places, means that it's much more likely that we're able to access positive electricity to many individuals. And think about the benefits we get as a result of this. We'd encourage you to use your imaginations. But second of all, we say that these renewables are often just comparatively cheaper. This means that solar panels in sunny areas cost a cent per kilowatt hour to produce energy compared to 8 to 12 cents for coal and similar costs for natural gas. The amount of economic benefits that we can get for developing countries is simply so large, it's just really important to these kinds of countries. But second of all, we said that these countries are going to have to implement this kind of green energy on either side of the house. So it looks like actors in the EU who are in cutting ties with non-green actors. It means that countries are going to become green because of climate change. We say that they can want to do this all they want, but if they do not have the ability or the capacity to do so, because renewables are simply not on the market, we say that it's going to be impossible for our fight against climate change. The problem on opposition side of the house is simply put that China has a monopoly on the industry. They install half of the world's solar cells. They're the largest producer of turbines. This means that they have a monopolistic incentive to just increase prices. But second of all, we say that China lacks the capacity to benefit everyone. We simply do not produce enough solar cells. We do not produce enough wind turbines to benefit everyone. When the US enters, we fix both of these problems. One, by encouraging massive competition between them in order to reduce prices and give it to the most vulnerable actors. But second of all, we say we also just have much more ability for us to give capacity for many people to access these kinds of things that otherwise does not exist. The impacts of this is mean that developing countries can uniquely benefit from renewables, and they can ameliorate the conditions of those who are just unable to help themselves in many circumstances, those who are going to be the most vulnerable to climate change. What this means is, at the end of the day, we're already winning on the climate change very concretely, but we're also winning on the economic benefits to people and the democratization of energy and capacity. For our planet and for humanity's survival, we're incredibly proud to propose.
I thank the first speaker for side proposition for that very fine speech, and I call upon the first speaker for side opposition to open up opposition's case. Here.
Okay. Is it required for me to like turn on my camera or?
Uh, no, if you don't want to do so, but it is encouraged. And also
Okay, you know
secondly,
what? Oh, sorry.
give me just 1 second. I need to do something really quickly.
Yeah, no worries.
Uh, okay, everything's fine now. So yeah, whenever you're ready.
Okay, give me like 10 seconds. Okay, my time will start on my first word. When BYD was announced to have far shorter charging time, far longer running time, and far lower prices than Tesla, the US could not retaliate, and so largely hasn't, rather than bolstering Tesla's propaganda. It's not because the US didn't put enough funding into the green industry. It's because the US didn't fund the green sector early enough. And if the US is to aggressively pursue the development of domestic renewable energy sector, it will mean a desperate attempt to tie in a game that the US has already lost. Opposition thinks it's not worth it for anybody, especially those who the US is impacting the most directly. First, I'll be framing what proposition has done wrong, and then I'll be going on to my two constructives. First, on framing that, there's two things under this. Number one, what does aggressive pursuing actually look like? Four things under this. Number one, the US taxing factories for using fossil fuels. Number two, investing large amounts of money into forcing oil sands to go green or large corporations go green. And the implication here is that it will inevitably take a big economic toll on the US no matter what, especially considering the mass amounts of tariffs that have been imposed on neighboring allies. Thirdly, cutting fossil fuel importations from major trade partners in energy like Canada and Saudi Arabia, heavy on Canada. And fourthly, it's probably going to take place in a rather short amount of time. Note that aggressively implies a time limit in order to maximize this policy's efficiency. Secondfold, what does development look like? One thing under this, the US ought to begin to develop and invest in corporations that provide manufacturing for green energy sources. Two implications, or two other things. Number one, the US will monetarily incentivize corporations to use green products, and the US will begin to become a green energy exportative country. The implication here is that the US wants to compete with China at an extremely fast and unrealistic pace. China has been a leading country in nearly all green sectors for as long as we can remember, as China has more manpower and a larger secondary industry. So, number one, then, it puts the American economy in an incredibly unstable place. Listen, proposition cannot eat all the pies. They cannot just say because of their model, they're able to evade the big bullet of the instability the American economy will be put inside. And the counterfactual here is very simple. There are always other sectors the US can invest in to compete with China and to not allow China to monopolize, I guess, which I think is highly unlikely for reasons I'll get onto later. If the US is willing to choose any other sector, we say that there's a shot at winning on the global stage. But the framing here is twofold. In a second. Number one, let's note, why will the US be still incredibly inefficient in exporting and domestically selling? Two reasons. Number one, it's because China is already winning. The US tariffs on Canada and Mexico are already prompting them to buy and import more products from China when compared to the US. But secondly, China has been setting their minds on this for decades. The US cannot catch up with China insofar as three reasons. Number one, the US has a far smaller secondary industry, less people to work in general, and less young people staying in the country as they grow up and get higher education. Secondfold, how will all these policies be received internationally? Generally, we think buy-in on this environmental coercion is going to be incredibly marginal. You sacrifice the much more mainstream industries into an industry that nobody is generally interested in, especially for the US. Tesla, for example, has already had an incredibly bad rap on the world stage because EVs from the US are far less cheaper and slow charging compared to Chinese EVs like BYD, and often its safety is questionable. But also, just because you align with an ideology doesn't mean people will buy in unless there is a mandate. Well, obviously, it's not possible. Just because you know the Arctic is melting doesn't make you recycle. Same with this. Just because Trump decides to turn green doesn't mean people on the international stage will have the political or economic will to go green. It is also more expensive just generally. And it doesn't mean environmental movements will align with this because it's very clear that the facade is obviously a sham. It's really filled with political rhetoric. Thirdfold, so essentially, there will be no reality in which America actually outcompetes or makes money from this. This is absolutely detrimental for domestic and international manufacturing. Large factories will, in fact, instead of going green, will most likely lobby for the revoking of the prop model and the mass laying off of employees in order to accommodate for taxes imposed by the government. I'll get onto the international implications in a little bit. The analysis here is then threefold. Number one, insofar as government isn't able to prove a world where the US is even able to marginally compete with China, we win because the economic impact directly impacts the US as well to continue on with this initiative, which implicitly leads to the environmental impact. But continuing, the US tariffs that Trump has imposed makes it incredibly problematic for other countries to buy American green energy, especially when empirically Chinese green energy is far cheaper compared to American products, no matter what purity says about their jacking up their prices. The legacy means that there is already a narrative that the US is not good at producing green energy. Secondfold, let's talk domestically. We think this policy will only become a political PR stunt as Trump tries to align himself with moderates who genuinely care about the environment. We think that generally people will not like this, as it fundamentally changes their way of life, etc., etc. It's going to be incredibly unpopular internationally, especially for right-leaning people who generally do not even care about the environment. Note that investing in green energy means taking away money for border patrol or education or healthcare. We win because of the fact that even domestically, it is incredibly bad for America, and America's economic instability puts the entire global market at risk. But also, it puts it puts the economy essentially in shambles, right? In a few years' time, when America has already lost, it will essentially be incredibly difficult for it to bounce back. This will naturally take a toll on the global economy because many developing countries literally depend on the US for economic stability, including China. If the US currency depreciates as a result of all this, it will reduce the amount of foreign investors that enter China because the safety net of the USD is effectively gone. Very quickly on the second argument of why the environmental impacts of this motion is far too marginal. This directly clashes with the prop's environmental argument. Three things under framing. Number one, what is our counterfactual? We tell you no matter what, the people who buy into American green energy, including governments, will be taking away from Chinese market share on prop. But on opposition, we tell you why it's necessary for China to develop their green energy sector so the US can buy from China. Secondfold, the issue with this motion is that even if this is good for the American economy, it doesn't impact the international economy, nor does it impact the environment. Know that this is a lose-lose game. The environment is unimpactful insofar as three things. Number one, nobody buys into genuinely supporting this policy. Number two, the US literally will only be able to marginally impact the environment on their best case when only certain corporations or hardcore Trump supporters align with this. Note that majority countries that even align with Trump will most likely not trade green energy with the US because of the fact that it's economically inefficient. But thirdly, note that furthermore, you block the mass importation of green products for countries that rely on the US for said importation of. Two things under this then. For these specific countries, their economy will essentially plunge along with their will to continue developing and producing green products. But essentially, you do not get cheaper products or more green development. The real reason why any development is even able to happen in the status quo is because all countries are incrementally developing. That is the tipping point. But also, why is the environment necessarily better on op? Four things. We allowed for China to actually develop green energy for cheaper prices. They will have a will to continue cheapening their prices because they are scared that the US will outcompete them in other industries. But more importantly, they want their soft power internationally to be speed plus cheap, as per how it's always been. Secondly, the implication of this is very simple. The US should not provoke China. It means further political turmoil and polarization on the world stage that ultimately becomes a lose-lose situation. And the US is able to compete with China by other means. But also, the US is already doing well in green energy by incrementally developing it. Instead of an aggressive push, which ends up being very polarizing, the US's incremental push for green energy of development will be seen as far less radical and be met with more support. But also, if proposition actually wants to impact the environment meaningfully, it probably looks like cutting funds to other industries like AI. But the reason why the US can't afford to do this is because of DeepSeek threatening US's position in the AI race. The issue being, even like the US isn't even in the environmental race to begin with. It simply is a net negative for all countries when the US is off putting the balance of green imports and exports. So the terminal impact then is twofold. Number one, insofar as proposition is unable to provide a counterfactual where the environment is meaningfully impacted, there's no inherent point in forcing only basically American corporations and people to buy into a deeply unpopular policy that most likely is such a big risk considering China that it will not benefit American economies. But secondfold and lastly, our framing refutes their second argument. It's highly realistic that the United States will only be using this for economic purposes instead of environmental purposes. Note how America has viewed climate goals in the past by pulling out of things like the Paris agreements and etc. On it, we think incremental is the way to go, and Curiti's BS model is obviously not going to make it far. On that basis, opposition ballot.
I thank the first speaker for side opposition for the fine speech, and I call upon the second speaker for side proposition to continue this debate. Hear, hear.
Okay. Can I confirm I'm audible and visible, please?
Both are fine currently.
All right, cool. Time begins with my first word. I'll take POIs in the chat, please. Opposition agrees with us, but in reality, what they've proposed on their side is to do nothing about what they want, or what we all want to solve in this debate. What proposition wants to do in this debate is incrementally approach environmental disaster. The important weighing in this debate is that there's immense urgency in promoting this policy in the current moment. There's urgency in preventing a point of no return and mitigating the worst harm to humanity, whereas environmental impacts always fluctuate and you can presumably impact your economy in other ways in the future. I want to do three things. First, I want to provide a bit of strategic observations. Second, I want to talk about the economic clash, explain why America is actually better off and other countries are better off. And third, I want to talk about the environmental clash and why we clearly win that clash in this debate. On strategic observations, one, this is not an actor motion. And this is really, really important. Opposition's only response to this is literally just that, well, other countries won't be affected by that. But that doesn't actually respond to the crux of the analysis, which is that this is not an actor motion. Other countries are more effective or more important. And if we can prove impacts to those countries, that is more important, even if they prove their harm to America. Secondly, their characterization of our model is remarkably flawed. I don't think we have to cut ties to or tax certain industries. All we have to do is develop a new industry of renewable energy, which is as the motion and Infoslide suggests. There's zero reason the trade-off has to be as large as they suggest. On the economy, the first thing I want to do is prove why our impacts to America are actually better. The first thing they say is that you can't compete and therefore it's massively harmful. But I will note, as Kirti explains, the problem for America is not a capacity problem. They have vast reserves of lithium and high tech. The reason that they aren't in the industry and they aren't competing is because they haven't had the incentive to do so in previous years. What does Kirti say? One, America is the leading technological hub of the world. Two, that there's massive monetary capital. And three, and this is really important, they have mass reserves of lithium and cobalt, which means that at the very least, the prices for things like batteries will go down, and that is a massive benefit on our side. Importantly, I have zero reason from their side as to why time is the issue here. Their own example of DeepSeek literally demonstrates how time is not necessarily a relevant weighing metric in this debate, because you can still enter markets even though other countries had head starts, as America had a head start in the AI industry and was massively cut off by DeepSeek. In fact, I would flip their claim. It's actually the opposite. When there's an existing competitor in the market, you can use their technology. You can speed up R&D costs by looking at what they do and using the technology in that way. So on all accounts, it's unclear as to why their harm actually exists. Secondly, I want to suggest the economic benefits to America as well. Number one, you can massively export through renewable energy. Like you can produce things like solar farms or wind farms, as China is doing right now, and presumably profit a lot. But secondly, green energy is also far cheaper, as Kirti explains, though the energy itself to power the economy is cheaper, which means that there's massive amounts of benefits on our side. They say you have a trade-off in terms of monetary cost. One, this is probably pretty marginal. At most, what they prove is very small because America is really massive. It's like $34 trillion in debt. Secondly, we actually proved that it benefits from this policy economically, which means that the monetary trade-off doesn't actually exist. Second part of this clash, how does this affect other clashes? I will note, number one, this is the more important consideration given this is not an actor motion. And second, that this also affects America to a large extent. The first is that there's far more access to renewable energy on our side. And all the empirical analysis Kirti provides in terms of why renewable energies are cheaper are only escalated when there's competition within the industry and when there's competition to compete. Now, I want to suggest, even if you don't believe that America can compete, America competing in this industry still lowers costs. And it's precisely what they concede in their speeches, which is that China doesn't want to get outcompeted by America. So even if America literally cannot compete against them, China is fearful that America will outcompete them, gain large amounts of market share in a really important industry, and therefore have massive amounts of incentive to innovate on their side as well, which still means we still get all the economic and environmental benefits. Secondly, Kirti explained modulation analysis that goes completely unresponded to. And this is really important. Alternatives like fossil fuels or nuclear energy only affect the largest populations. You have to scale based on unit, and there's really, really high, they're only highly cost effective when it's really large in terms of energy density. But the problem is you have to build plant by plant, whereas on our side, you can build solar cell by solar cell or turbine by turbine. And this is important given literally half the population of America lives in rural states like Wyoming or other, outside of major cities where they probably can't implement the types of energy that they want effectively. And also the vast majority of the population of the world lives in the developing world where populations are highly dispersed. Third, I want to point out that there's massive price volatility on their side. If they stay on the existing alternatives of things like fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are uniquely unstable. There's massive supply chain problems with them. There's geopolitical tensions as seen in the Houthis in the Red Sea and Russia and Ukraine. If natural resources and energy is as important to the economy as opposition suggests, then price volatility has an equal and opposite negative impact on the economy. It means there's massive layoffs when these harms happen. It means massive economic harms on their side. Before I explain why environment is better on our side, are there any PYs? Okay, no PYs again. In terms of the environment, they say that people won't buy, like countries won't buy into the environment on our side, and that is harmful. The first thing they say is that, this won't transition. I think we do prove that America can be stronger. And all the analysis in terms of, why even if America doesn't win, it still encourages China to compete is really important because at the very least, we still get more innovation and more R&D into the green tech industry. Secondly, they say people fear Trump, like Trump will be gone in 4 years. Also, it's unclear as to how strong this mechanism actually is. And then they say that there's also like a large reason to transition, which is obviously like cost and money. So like even if you fear Trump, presumably you would still transition towards green tech, given all the urgency analysis that we provided in Curity speech, given like economies literally need to transition in many instances to access trade partners like the EU in this debate. So what does Curity explain? One, he explains that there's increased access to renewable energies on our side, where the cost to transition goes down substantially because battery costs go down because there's competition, and that means that there's you can access green tech and renewable energy for much cheaper. That means that it actively encourages countries to transition far more because they're able to do so with far less of a trade-off. Because obviously, like this decision is a cost-benefit analysis. On our side, the cost goes down, but the benefit still stays the same, which means there's more incentive to transition. Second, he explains that there's more innovation into green tech. It means it's more effective wind turbines on our side, more efficient batteries, cheaper batteries, things that are really important in green technology and making sure that these energy sources are beneficial as possible. I also want to point out what the comparative on their side is, which they have zero response in terms of the environment. Number one, they have massive extraction harms from natural resources. Extraction harms things like ecosystems, local populations, and habitats. And even countries that don't directly extract also directly contribute because they increase the demand for things like fossil fuels and encourage further extraction. Secondly, there's obviously massive carbon dioxide emissions on their side, which escalates climate change. And notably, this is something that's very irreversible. Carbon dioxide will stay in the atmosphere for literal centuries. It has localized harms in terms of like air pollution, water pollution, and those harms are all really, really harmful on their side. The bottom line is that they significantly escalate climate change on their side of the house. They escalate the harms that Curity illustrates in terms of natural disasters, in terms of the economic harms to individuals, in terms of the human impacts on people as well. So that is the reason as to why we are better on the environment. On weighing, even if you believe that the economy is what proposition wins or opposition wins, the environment is simply more important. And the weighing here is very simple on vulnerability. Economic benefits disproportionately trickle to the top. The top 1% of the world population has 40% of the world's global wealth. The benefits of a booming economy flow to business owners. It flows to CEOs. It flows to executives rather than the vast majority of individuals at the bottom. In comparison, climate change disproportionately harms the poor. The poor cannot insulate themselves from higher prices, from price shocks or natural disasters. They cannot afford air conditioning when weather increases. They cannot pay for shelter or reallocate when natural disasters hit. So the bottom line is that this debate is not an actor motion. Even if it was an actor motion, America still gets harmed. For all those reasons, we're very happy to propose.
I thank the second speaker for side proposition for that very fine speech. And I would like to remind everyone to give out intake POIs before inviting the second speaker for side opposition to continue their case. Here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, indeed you are.
Okay, thank you. Just give me like 1 second. I'll start my speech. The entire prop case rests on one big assertion. When the US invests into domestic renewable energy sectors, the global and total development of the renewable energy on a global stage increases. We tell you this is untrue. Note that the US is miles behind China, but when they aggressively pursue the development of domestic renewable energy sector, people turn and invest into the US instead. This weakens the
the leader in this field, China's ability to push for more developed renewable energy by a lot. The U.S. pursuing aggressive development for renewable energy is a lose-lose scenario, like Leo tells you. The USA will still lose to China, but China's ability to develop renewable energy is greatly reduced at the same time. First, then, why China will always outcompete? I think this is a very key thing to address. I think Leo already tells you enough that first, China is so far ahead in the field. Second, that like China is like just like naturally built to like develop things like renewable energy much better than the U.S. First, then, on buying from other countries, we tell you that heavy tariffs from the U.S. means it's harder for other countries to buy U.S. renewable tech in the first place. Second, U.S. is investing into this field too late. This is to say that China is already in the lead by far. Note here that China has 30% reliance on renewable energy. USA only has 8. 3, then China has much cheaper labor. This is to say that it inherently easy to develop renewable energy in a country like China, but also note that China still earns a lot of money. The two clashes so far is first on economic stability and second on environmental protection. On economic stability, there's a few things. First, Leo tells you that the aggressive investment causes economic instability. I'll tell you about economic growth as an alternative later in my constructive. But second, why US cannot catch up to China in the first place? They have a much smaller secondary industry, and that China's already far more developed. So then, why does this actually cause instability? First, in that we tell you the policies are heavily opposed. Either people buy into renewable energy, it's more expensive, it costs more, and like generally the renewable energy sucks in compared to fossil fuels, etc. But second, people just don't buy into renewable energy as a whole. Just a lot more money spent on investment, and the environmental impacts aren't necessarily reached from prop. We tell you like people would probably not do this switch because it's just very expensive in itself. Then third, competition means more econ developed. This is something that comes out of prop. I don't think it's true. If the investment happens, then China's ability is greatly cut. The US doesn't get that much development in itself because like they're behind China already. Then if the investment doesn't happen in the first place, this means that there's just no economic benefit that come out of prop. How does the US get this money in the first place then? If the US doesn't reduce investment in other fields, how do they invest into renewable energy? If they have extra money, then they can simply invest into other industries. Economically, it's just better. Note that a good global economy means that if everyone is able to develop environmental technologies much better. Yeah, I'll take a PI.
So is your comparative just like we just lie down and just take it and like just lose?
Comparative is that the development of renewable energy is very slow and far more nuanced. We use that money, we don't aggressively develop and cost a lot of money. We use that money to develop into other sectors that can probably make the world economy like as a whole a lot better. Then on environmental protection, we tell you that environmental change is very symmetric. This is to say that you will weaken China's ability and strengthen the US very marginally on prop. We don't see why that's a good thing when China, the leading actor in this in renewable technology, is cut by ways when they are unable to develop more technology, or the ability to develop more technology is far weakened. Know that China's literally cooking the status quo. China's developing a lot of renewable technology. They're literally doing really well in this status quo. But no, this development also quite heavily relies on outside investment. USA will take away market share and investment. US is a very prestigious asset country. This is to say that people will invest into the US, but this means that less people invest into China as well. Why then does investment in US doesn't mean that they can outcompete China? First, China has natural advantage. I already told you about this. But also note that like more countries just can't purchase from US because it's very expensive. Because China's is very cheap, and like because China's such a much leader, they're like technology is probably much better in itself as well. Then on economic growth, we tell you that economic growth is something that is bound to happen on opposition. Note that the economic growth of the USA is very important because note that the US has economy growth and so does the world. This is to say that a lot of countries in the world generally relies heavily on the USA's currency. This is to say a lot of countries rely on USA, and like USA, the value of the US dollar literally determines the values of like every single other currency. So the 4 parts of this extension: A, what does the alternative likely look like? B, why economic growth happened very domestically? C, why prop cannot claim these economic developments? D, why does this domestic economic growth have a very international impact? First, on what the alternative, one second. First thing on what the alternative looks like. Rather than investing into green energy, a race you will never win, you invest into another sector that's not already dominated by another country. Note then that in this case, China. Note then that China's cheap labor is already way ahead of the curve compared to USA. This is to say that no matter how much investment you get, you'll always be outcompeted by China. Yeah, take a PI.
So is like the US investing like $3 or $4 billion going to crash like every single like dollar of every single other country?
No, but I think it looks like this. The more money you invest, the more aggressive like your development will probably be. This is to say that like if you tell me this investment that US puts into renewable energy is very small, and all the economic harms that Leo tells you and the economic benefits I'm about to bring you doesn't happen, neither does all the benefit coming from your side, because the development probably going to be very nuanced on your side as well. That isn't what the motion is, like that isn't actually aggressive development. Note then what the alternative looks like. No, I already talked about, sorry. Why economic growth happens then? It is intuitive that investing and growing in industries that you can actually compete and earn profit from is much, much more economically beneficial. This is to say that you create many new things like new jobs, new technologies, and new industry chains. Also note that all that needs to prove to you is that the alternative gets more economic development than investing into a field that you will never win anyways. This is to say that if I cannot outcompete China in this field in the first place, I don't see why we should attempt to outcompete China if you're going to lose to them anyways. Understanding then that having competitors doesn't mean more solar panels or more development like like the environment cases try to frame to you. Like Leo already tells you, all it means that investment is now spread towards US as well, or in other words, less money go to China. This means that China is able to develop less renewable energy. They manufacture less, and this is to say that generally we want China to get more investments because they're the leader or they're the leading force in renewable energy. This is to say that when we invest in money, they probably develop new technologies. We don't need another country like developing the exact same technology that we already have already. We don't think that's very beneficial, and like the amount of like value we can get for our investment on China is just much, much larger. But also note that it is intuitively very, very, very expensive for the USA to develop this technology. That means that to reach the amount of development in the sector that China has, they probably spend way more than like the POI I get. It's like 3 or 4 billion, probably spent much, much more money than that. The US has to spend a lot more money because they're already far behind to even like balance their playing field with China in the first place. Why then is economic growth very limited on prop? Intuitively, when you're heavily invested into a field that yields very little economic gain, you are losing money. Know that it is very likely that people buy from China on prop simply because the Chinese products are cheaper and more advanced. So then the prop has two possible stances. A, you invest heavy funds to catch up to China, unlikely to happen in the first place. This requires so much money that Leo's economic instability impacts are magnified far more. And B, alternatives could have earned a lot more money that's generally beneficial to a global economy. But B, then you're just still losing to China because you're not investing enough money. You're stuck in the cycle of a losing game. You're never going to get your money back. That means either you neither get your money back or you get the environmental development that prop claims that they get on their side. Then, what are the international impacts of USA having a very, very strong economic growth from this? Leo already tells you about the economic harms of aggressive investment into renewables energy sectors. We're going to bring you the international economic benefits of like investing into alternatives. Note then that the US has a very strong economy. If the US has a strong economy, so does the rest of the world. A lot of countries are very dependent on the American dollar. The American dollar is the center of value of currency worldwide. This means that other countries who are very dependent on the US dollar are able to invest into their renewable energy resources. Note the key difference with the US is that they're probably leading actors in this race already. It's probably much easier for them to develop, e.g. Brazil, e.g. New Zealand. When global economy is better, when these countries don't have to when these countries have excess money because the American economy is better, because the global economy is better, they're able to invest more of their excess money into these fields. We tell you when they invest into these fields, on a long term, the environmental net benefits that we get from prop is balanced out. So then note why we win the two main clashes. First, on environmental, we flip this argument. We tell you we'd rather have leaders or people who are so far deeply invested into this curve, into this race, do very, very well because new technology is created. While that is untrue on our proposition. But second, on economic instability, we tell you that it's just much wiser for the US to develop into fields that benefit the US economy and thus the global economy. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
I thank the second speaker for side opposition for the fine speech, and I call upon the third speaker for side proposition to continue the debate. Here.
All right, I'll just assume I'm loud and clear. Okay.
Yep, you're both visible and audible, loud and clear.
All right. So I just want to point out the insane logic coming out of the opposition team. Their logic is just that just because somebody did something first, you should just not try. This is analogous to telling a poor person that you just shouldn't try to improve the quality of your life because other rich people exist. This is like saying, just because Russia started the space program first, NASA should have never existed and we should have never funded them. This was an absolutely insane line of logic. That claim must not stand. I want to talk about three things. First, I just want to, before I even go into that, just gut check every single one of their claims when you're adjudicating this debate. Most of their claims are completely illogical and ridiculous to the extent that I think it's actually worth just not discrediting them, even if I don't respond to them. But I'm going to be charitable. I'm going to respond to all their claims. Three themes then. Firstly, in terms of the environmental clash. Secondly, in terms of the economic clash. Lastly, in terms of China, because China will be so mad when the US and China are already on the opposite ends of the geopolitical spectrum. So firstly, in terms of the climate. I always want to first point out as to why this case we're actually able to get a massive impact in terms of the climate. Because the US is right now is I think either the largest or the second largest greenhouse gas emitter. So if we reduce the gases, which are emitted by the power, like the oil and coal power plants, as well as natural gas, that impacts the rest of the world in a massive way and is a massive benefit. So why was climate change incredibly important? Here's what they say. Firstly, countries don't want to use Trump's items. The first thing I want to point out is that this is an incredibly short-termist way of thinking. So it's probably incredibly unlikely, first of all, that Trump will continue a 25% of tariff and keep it for the next 20 years. Second of all, I don't think Trump's going to be in power for the next 20 years. You have to think about this in the next 30 to 50 years time frame. So this is a long-term plan. Presumes that Trump will be the rest of the world will be fine with using American items 20 to 30 years from now. Secondly, they said that this is incredibly expensive, as its cost was the reason to not save the world. So we explained to you as to how we reduce the cost slowly. Like, how did China make its tech sector? They have lots and lots of smart people. And also there was a bit of espionage. So presumably it's the case that we can probably steal some of the things and get some of the solar panels and have our scientists look at that. We also have probably the equivalent, or if not more amounts of smart people internationally to actually create things like innovation. Security explained to you very, very clearly as to why we had the capacity to actually innovate, none of which has gotten any sort of responses by them. So what this means is that we're able to compete with China. Like, the US tech sector is like the best in the world for a reason. I am very, very unclear as to why it is the case that green tech is oh so hard to compete in, when there are in fact like green tech startups. Like, the difference that we give them like $1 million of subsidies or like $1 billion, right? So what they then said under the climate theme was that people don't buy in. Firstly, their mechanism was about Trump. Trump, as I already pointed out, is probably not going to be in power in the next 4 to 8 years, right? Second of all, people will probably just buy things if they're cheaper. So other countries, when they see the competition between the US and China, and they have to compete against each other, they'll presumably use these sorts of items if it was the case that one was going to be cheaper than the other. But thirdly, the climate impacts are in fact very tangible to people, contrary to what opposition tells you. Like, look at the hurricanes that have gone significantly worse for the past 5 years. The amount of economic damage and the amount of deaths that has happened through wildfires, through hurricanes, has massively increased in the past 5 years. So it is very, very tangible as to people as to what climate change actually does. I'll take you later. But fourth of all, this isn't an opportunity cost. I just want to explain to you how the US budget actually works. So there are sections, right? So there's a military section and there's like a subsidy section, right? So we're taking money within the subsidy section, which every year actually changes in terms of reallocation. So this is something completely normal, and giving like a couple billion out of like out of the $30 trillion US economy into towards the green technology sector. So it's never ever clear to me why there was such a massive opportunity cost or massive harm over here. So why was the climate change actually so important? Because there was a tangible difference between the amount of climate change that actually happens. Because it does appear that first op did in fact concede that the climate was important, but they only wanted it for it to happen very, very slowly. But the difference is that there's a difference of magnitude and harm in terms of the speed. So because a 1 Celsius increase in global temperature means like pretty bad disasters, but it's survivable. But a 5-degree increase in terms of global temperature means catastrophic disasters, like massive droughts and wildfires. To the extent that means the most of Africa will actually be unable to create enough food, and it'll actually starve. So what that meant was that any sort of mild decrease in terms of the amount of climate damage actually happens was going to be a massive benefit in terms of our side. But secondly, as to why we should actually care about the climate. No, thank you. It was that this affects the poor way hard. I'll take you that after the theme on the economy. Rich countries are able to protect themselves against the harm of climate mitigation. So they can do things like build dikes when the sea levels rise, as we've seen in places like the Netherlands, as well as mitigate the harms of wildfires, and as well as rebuild faster after hurricanes. But poor countries don't actually have the luxury of being able to protect themselves. They're hit much harder when their agricultural industries are hit by massive droughts. They can't protect their coastlines against the rising sea levels. They find it more and more difficult to rebuild every single year as hurricanes and typhoons inside of areas like East Asia get worse and worse, and you don't have the luxury of spare billions of dollars. What that meant was that in terms of the environmental damage, there was going to be a massive amount of environmental damage that only happens under their side when you don't have these things as fast. But also, there was a massive economic harm that happens when the environment got worse. I'll take your POI.
Is extra cobalt enough to make the US's green technology cheaper than China's green technology?
Yes, because you need like supplies. And we have the supplies, we have the manpower, we have the incentive to act. Like, if you listen to the past, like how many minutes of my partner's speeches, you would presumably realize that yes, we can in fact compete. That should have never been contentious. I'm really not sure why you guys are making it so. So what were the harms of the economy that happened under their side, and what are the economic benefits over here? The first thing I want to point out that there was a massive economic harm when it was the case that the environment got significantly worse and worse. You got to think of it like this. I think over half the world's population lives near the coastline. They can't live there anymore when the sea levels rise to a pretty large extent. But secondly, it was a case that when you can't do things like grow crops because of the massive amount of droughts, that significantly reduces your economy, especially for poor countries who are mainly agricultural. But it's also just that there was a massive economic benefit under our side. So opposition says under here was that First of all, the American economy will be crushed when you subsidize, the renewable energy by like 30 or $40 billion out of like a $30 trillion economy. First of all, the American economy is the largest in the world. It has like $30 trillion. Second of all, so like the amount of subsidies, while large, is like $2 to $3 billion like every single year. That is a drop in the bucket towards the massive amount of money that the American government makes every single year. This also responds to the idea that the dollar, whatever, increases in hard developing countries because like the dollarization or whatever. I'm not sure. It's a weird economic impact that I think they saw from around that Matthew Farrell did. But like it's a very slight, tiny, marginal decrease because like the $30 billion doesn't actually like change the amount of money that the U.S. is using because it was already within the budget before. But it's also $30 billion really is literally a drop of the market. So what they then never respond to actually was the massive economic benefits that we gave you. We told you about how we're able to not just help the American economy because you're creating a bunch of jobs, especially in the tech sector, but how this also massively economically benefits smaller countries. But the smaller countries that are now able to utilize, especially for poorer areas, people who are areas that are much rural, they're now able to access things like electricity, for example, when they have much better solar powers. So what that means that instead of doing hand agriculture, they'll use machines instead to make their lives significantly much easier. That means they're able to plant more foods inside of areas that are very, very poor. Their only response towards this was that, well, China will be incredibly unhappy that you're doing this. First of all, I just want to point out that China doesn't actually control the entire market. They only control like some of it. We can still catch up to it. Second of all, they don't actually understand how innovation actually works. Sure, they might innovate and create the same innovations, but you massively increase the incentive to innovate even faster. So because when you have the most amount of control, there's no incentive for you to innovate faster. But when you have a competitor, presume that means you have to basically be better than them because you decrease prices or have much more capabilities to act. So what that means that innovation actually does in fact happen on our side, especially when funding lots and lots of money and pouring lots of money inside of it. But thirdly, China and the United States are at the opposite end of geopolitics anyways and compete a lot anyways. It was never clear to me, and I'm not sure as to what the delta even is, when they had to prove a tipping point in the to create a trade war or like an actual conflict when they already compete in so many areas. I'm not sure why competing just inside of the green renewable technology is actually going to be massive. So at the end, all opposition's logic just does not work out. It was never clear to me as why just because somebody did it first means that we should not do it later. But what we got was massive environmental benefits and massive economic benefits under our side. We're very, very happy to propose. Thank you.
I thank the third proposition speaker for the fine speech, and I call upon the third opposition speaker to conclude the first part of this debate. Here.
I'll start on my first word. Panel, we currently have an excess of green technology and a deficit of demand. Demand is the reason then why the entirety of GovSide falls in this round. Because if countries on our side of the house are unwilling to purchase green energy from China, where costs have already been shrunk down massively, they clearly are simply just not interested in implementing it. It is not that it is not accessible. Two themes. Firstly, the environment, then the economy. Firstly, about the environment. I'd just like to point out that firstly, this claim is incredibly exaggerated because government side never points out to us why the creation of a green sector in the US is necessarily the tipping point between global destruction and success. And so their ultimate end impact about the world burning up and everybody dying is not proved. But also at the same time, they don't necessarily prove to us why emissions in the US are going to be reduced, why you are necessarily going to transition to green energy in the US. Because creating an industry does not necessarily mean implementing it on a large scale. Government side needs to prove to us why Trump will be willing to supplement their fossil fuels with expensive green technology. What then does government side tell you under this theme? They tell us that more cobalt and lithium and natural resources means more batteries and therefore more green technology and cheaper green technology. There are three reasons why this is false. Panel, please note this down because this takes down all of the environmental push that comes from government side of the house. Charlie is so incredibly wrong when he tells us that natural resources are enough to allow the US to make cheaper products than China. So panel, if I prove that nobody buys products from the US, we win this round because then there is neither an economic nor environmental benefit. First reason why you do not help the environment more is because having more batteries is not the sole reason why you have cheap green technology. Because sure, we can see the fact that US probably does have deposits of cobalt, but obviously China has cobalt as well. It is not that they have suddenly run out of materials within their country. The key differentiator between China and US is not the fact that one country has more natural resources than the other. It is because one has more human resources than the other. One has cheap labor and the other doesn't. So the green technology that China produces will always be cheaper because of their human resources. Terrence also tells us that the US is the central hub of technology. So I'll fill in a mechanization here for him and presume that he wanted to say that this means that you can cross-apply technology in order to make cheaper green technology. But quite importantly, the technology that the US has is not as specialized and not as useful as those which China has. Because even if you develop AI in the US, right? Even if you do develop like microchips in the US, I am unsure as to why that will help you manufacture things like solar panels physically. But panel, I can flip this because China actually has even better technology to apply to green sources because China dominates the EV sector, and this is because they are great at creating batteries. Batteries then are accepted by government side to apparently be the best thing in this round. Then we tell you that China has better specialized technology because they are better able to produce more batteries. But secondly, they literally have developed green technology. Sure, even if you do have factories that create microchips on Gov side, you might be able to cross-apply that in order to develop green technology. But when you literally have factories that develop solar panels, obviously, this is much more helpful than having factories that produce microchips. Simply having more cobalt or general technological information will not mean that you're being better at producing green technology, and it also does not mean that you'll produce it faster, because cobalt is symmetrical, but human resources and specialized technology is not, because China literally already has solar panel factories and wind turbine factories. They're literally the leading players in batteries in the status quo, and act like they actually have relevant technological information. The second reason why as to you cannot help the environment more on Gov is because China just has a very large starting advantage. Your products are never going to be bought if they are lower quality and more expensive. So sure, you might be able to put up more panels in the market, but the fact is nobody will buy them if the panels are both more expensive and lower quality than those that come from China. Because like Kirti already concedes to you in your speech, there are so many prerequisites to creating green technology. This includes the investment into mining operations, into manufacturing firms which produce those panels, and the facilitation of global trade with green technology. There are just so many prerequisites to being able to create a product that hits the market globally and is actually successful that you will literally never be able to catch back up to the work that China has already put in. This is exactly like trying to raise somebody who has a decade's worth of a head start. You will always have the worst product because they have had more time than you. I'll take a point.
Okay, so you still haven't responded to your insane change in logic, which is that just because somebody started something first doesn't mean you can't catch up to them. If this was true, why did China even invest in AI?
No. Okay, this obviously isn't true. AI is something completely different. I think that this is simply because AI is like technologically based, but there's so many physical prerequisites that you need in order to develop green technology. These two things are simply not applicable. The third reason is that the demand for green technology does not increase. And so this also responds to the POI. More people are not going to buy more green technology just because there's more supply. Panel, let's say that I have 10 apples and 20 potential buyers and only 5 of them are purchased. But let's say that I add 10 more apples, which are both lower quality and also more expensive. Obviously, only 5 of the apples will be bought again. The reason why those 15 buyers did not try to get an apple was not because there was a deficit of apples, it was because they did not need it. And at the end of the day, again, because your products are worse, more expensive, and lower quality, the green technology that is bought are never going to be yours. More people are not necessarily going to use green technology or shift to green technology just because more green technology exists on the market. The demand remains the same. So panel, government side needs to realize this fact because in the status quo, we already have an excess amount of green technology. Adding more to that excess does not encourage more people to buy it, and it does not encourage more people to use it, especially when the technology that you're adding is objectively worse than the original. And so panel, what you see that is that there's literally no competition and there's no pressure for China to decrease their prices because the choice is incredibly clear. No country will ever buy from the US because their products are cheaper and better. Therefore, panel, these were 3 reasons as to why countries get no additional environmental impact. Because Terrence is indeed correct when he tells us that this debate is mostly about other countries and not about the US. But the fact is that people will still buy from China because their technology is cheaper and better. There's no deficit of green technology, and so the US is therefore not solving any problem on accessibility either. But fifth, panel, let's go into government side's very, very best case. We're sure countries do indeed buy the US's environmental technology, despite it being more costly and worse. There are 2 reasons why this is bad. Firstly, countries are able to help the environment less because they get worse technology at higher prices. Secondly, China will get less investment for their development into actually good technology because if less people buy into China, they get less funding. And so therefore you get worse green technology overall. Government side needs to realize that this is not a battle between China and US. Because like Terrence loves to tell you, this is not a debate about the US's success. If we funnel all of our investment, all of the global investment and purchases into China's green sector, this means that we are inevitably able to create better and cheaper green technology overall. So panel, please take notes on this. Secondly, the economy. Frankly, these same exact mechanizations function to bring down this entire theme because you will not be able to sell your products that you create within the sector because there's no demand for it because they're expensive and bad products. There's no niche to fill because China is already producing in excess of green technology. Nobody's going to buy it. More people are not going to buy into it. Therefore, government side solves nothing about the environment because nobody new is going to buy green technology and they throw away money while doing so. We tell you that in this situation where government side literally achieves nothing at all, even the bare minimum of simple investment into existing industries on our side of the house would be much more beneficial than the inexistent economic and environmental benefits that come from government side of the house.
I thank the third opposition speaker for the fine speech, and I call upon the opposition's reply to conclude their case. Hear.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you should be, right?
It's gonna die really soon. Okay. Speech was not my first word. A poor person can attempt to compete with the average person, but if he is pushed to compete with Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, his chances of success are just as slim as US's chance of success to outcompete China in the renewable energy sector. The reality is that this is not the space race, this is not AI. The reality is that the US is so far behind China that at this point, the amount of economic investment it would take for the US to even level playing ground with China is so much that it's just not worth it. We're not saying that it's impossible for the US to outcompete China or to reach equal playing ground. We're saying that the amount of investments they take is so large and will harm everything else as so much that's just done. 3 questions here for Pop that cost him this round. 1, how does the US outcompete China in this sector without economic harms that Leo brought you? Know that China invests trillions of dollars to get to where they are. If the US wants to be able to invest an equivalent amount of money, the economic instability case from Leo's stance is very much magnified. 2, if the global economy is doing bad because the American economy is doing bad, how is the rest of the world, including America, able to develop renewable energy? Thus, the economy is intuitively much more important than the environment on the short term. Note that US allies can develop renewable technology as well as they're already in this competition. 3, then, why would people buy from the US and not China when Chinese technology is better and cheaper? The reality is that people don't. Forming clashes then. First on China, USA, and whether or not US is actually possible for US to catch up to China. Second on economic, and why we think that on our side we have better economic benefits and on their side have a lot of economic harms. Third on environment. Fourth on e-commerce environment, why I think economy is more important. First then on China versus USA, we tell you first that China is very far ahead. If you're slightly behind, you can catch up. If you're this far behind, as of trillions of dollars, then you will either A, never catch up, or B, catch up and cost a lot of money. Both of these are very bad. But also note that China's just built for developing new technology. This is to say they have cheaper manufacturing, they have very cheap labor, they have heavy emphasis on efficiency. This is to say it makes it even harder for US to catch up to China. Aaron already tells you this in his speech. We tell you it's just an unworthy investment overall. Second, then economic. Leo tells you in his economic hard argument, the amount of money is crucial to keep the global econ stable. Intuitively, when you lose a race like this, which you're bound to, your economy suffers damage. Or if you invest trillions and trillions of dollars into a race that you really just don't get much from, the global economy is still very much harmed. Second, then economic benefit on our side, the money could be invested into alternatives. I tell you this already, but intuitively, you earn more and you invest into more profitable sectors. Note that good global economy means more tech development overall. What Prop says to this then is that competition means more innovation. This is just plainly untrue. When US develops exactly what China's already developing just to catch up with them, we don't see how innovation is made. Then on the environmental clash, we tell you that people buy from China and not the US. That means the US development is completely useless on a global environmental scale. This is to say because China's cheaper and just better enough as a status quo that people just don't buy from the US. So the only marginal impact they can get from Prop is that
the US in itself uses their own technology, and that is like slightly better for the environment. Note then that China's development in renewable technology is much more important because what does both sides renewable development looks like? First, on China, we tell they provide you a lot of new tech that's like new and actually innovative, and they actually have more efficient creation and more tech overall. What does US look like then? We tell that exactly what they just produce exactly what China has, and it's just less development efficiency overall. Be very logical and intuitive here. Which one is better for the environment? Note that both Leo and I tell that increased investment in the US means decreased investment in China. The only impact probably can reach in is that the USA has marginally better environment because it's unwilling to buy from China. Then on the e-commerce environment, we tell that even if we can see that can get a very marginal impact from prop, the econ is still much more important. Twofold to this. First of all, prop's environmental impact are very marginal. Only the USA's environment is affected in the first place on prop side. Everyone else is brought from China symmetrically. But secondfold, also note that the econ is just much more important. This is to say, when there's a good global economy, countries are able to develop all these tech a lot easier. This includes green tech. This includes green tech in countries like New Zealand or Brazil that are already part of this industry. Note then that the USA is able to buy from New Zealand and Brazil, and this is at the end of the day able to reach the environmental impacts that prop tries to bring in the first place because like they don't have like as much beef with New Zealand or Brazil as they have with China. So for all four of these reasons, first, the US will never catch up, which is a strategically unwise decision, an economically unwise decision for USA to invest so heavily and so aggressively into a field they will never win. Second, on the economic harm and benefit, of how USA just earn more money and it's better for the global economy as a whole. And third, on the environment, how like the environment benefits they can reach is very, very marginal. And fourth, on how economy is just most important clash in this round, I'm very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the opposition reply speaker for the defined speech, and I call upon the proposition reply speaker to conclude this debate as a whole. Here.
Am I audible and visible?
Both are fine.
Okay. My time will begin in 3, 2, 1. This isn't a debate between the China and the US. This is simply a false dichotomy pushed on opposition for no reason. Look, we say we win this debate simply put because we say that there's plenty of demand that exists for solar panels. Because if there was no demand and cheap panels were available everywhere, we say that every country in this world would be entirely green. We say that this technology has been incredibly expensive even currently, and what the US competing does is allow us to lower prices in 3 potential ways, only one of which is engaged with by opposition. We say that immediately we win this debate, but we're still going to engage with them. First of all, what was this debate about? Note that this was about whether or not it's a broadly beneficial policy, and that's the only thing that matters. We have fiat in this motion. Therefore, opposition counter-modeling for no reason why we have to destroy other sectors to do so simply doesn't make sense. But second of all, they can't claim we're going to spend trillions of dollars on this because it's just simply not the way the world works. Let's please have some gut check here. What we say is, as a result, we defend the model we provided and the simple way that China developed its energy sector that is a domestic sector of energy. It's within the terms of the model. It's very clear. What opposition did do in their case, though, is drop their positive case and simply say it's useless globally. We still win by producing any slight margin of change. 2 themes, capacity for change then. First of all, note, you do not have to compete against China. We say the entire market has not been accessed and there's needs that exist that the US can fill. It's not a zero-sum game here. Why is this true? We told you in the first that batteries are prohibitively expensive. We say that because green energy is objectively better than any other energy source, like because of modularization or any of the other reasons that we gave you, this means that the demand is simply not nothing, and therefore China's overproducing these kinds of panels because this is incredibly assertive and basically just beats their case immediately. But sure, even if China is monopolized, they still don't. You still don't access the reserves that we highlighted. You still don't access the scientists. We are still winning by increasing innovation. We're winning on increasing mining. But look, they haven't proven the incentive that China has to give really cheap panels to everyone in the world because they're not perfect actors. Obviously, they still care about their economy. They care about their yuan. This means that, like, yeah, they're going to win. But look, their false trade-off here was that investors are going to move. But like intuitively, these are giant economies that have billions of dollars that they can invest with whatever they want in the form of subsidies. There's no investors that are moving. And if it was true that the US just sucks at making panels so much so that it's going to do nothing, we said that no investors would move, and then this debate it still exists, and we would get all of their impacts on their side. They have falsely made a comparative repeatedly and then shifted it 4 different times. We say that we immediately just win if the US buys their own panels, which they conceded in the reply themselves. This means we've already provided three different ways that you can vote on proposition here. We say that mining reserves and innovation are enough to provide massive reductions in cost. So the lithium reserves in the US are on par with China's. We say that you would double the amount of lithium, reducing costs. But innovation that producing better cells, so like if you have a solar panel that produces 60% instead of 40%, the entire world has this much more energy. Three different ways that you can win on either side of the house. You have none so far in opposition. But this is all in our worst case because this is all on our worst case here. We say that on weighing that the environment does matter more than anything else because the economies of the developing countries are going to get absolutely devastated if they have hurricanes, floods, and droughts every other year. This means that the economy of them losing some of their quite literally their reserve currency, not their main currency, is clearly not going to create the kind of scope of impact that they're trying to get here to simply beat out the fact that we're just producing twice as much lithium in the world now here. And we're creating twice as much innovation. We're getting twice as much effectiveness. Our claims are just simply much more solvent than theirs because they clearly link to at least the broad scale ability to access green technology. We say that people are going to do this because we're worried about climate change. It's quite literally cheaper. We're going to get more people to access technology. Note, all of this has been unengaged with. Their claim on economic implications do not matter because if the USD just gets weakened, like we see in the financial crisis, the economies recover, but the world is not going to recover when it's burning and being devastated by hurricanes and droughts. At the end of the debate, what do you need to know in order for this debate to occur? One, there's nothing that we've seen actually concretely done from opposition. They claim a false comparative that simply does not exist. Very clearly on proposition, we see at the very least the US buys their own panels. We win immediately, changing one economy, but we have more lithium in the market. We have more research. We're incredibly proud to propose.
I thank the prop reply speaker for that fine speech and everyone for what was a great debate. And I call upon all of you to virtually shake hands and exit the room, and we will come back with the call that you will hear very, very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.